Hi, this is Randy Horton, Chief Solutions Officer of Orthogonal, here with Josh Sackman, Founder and President of AppliedVR. Josh, it's great to have you here today. I know we tried to connect for an interview at the MedTech conference back in Toronto, but things got kind of busy, so I'm glad we were able to connect after the conference.
Thanks for having me, Randy.
So we're going to cover a couple topics. We want to talk a little bit about about what's going on with Applied VR, maybe talk a little bit about virtual reality in healthcare and med tech. And then finally, wanted to talk about a topic that I gather is very near and dear to your heart, which is how can companies doing digital technologies in med tech have a successful business model? How can they get paid for the value they create? So, unless you have any questions, let's dive in.
Let's do it.
All right. So first of all, tell us just a little bit about you, your current role, and maybe your background, how you landed here. Because I'm guessing in kindergarten you didn't say that I was gonna, you know, make regulated medical devices using virtual reality and bring your dad to school day or something.
Yeah, most people are still surprised. That's what I do. And so my journey into healthcare actually started as a child growing up with chronic pain. I had congenital ligament issues at 8 years old. I had a torn meniscus, which turned into a staph infection and several weeks of hospitalization and several months of painful rehab. And that was the first of many healthcare encounters that I had. And so growing up with that, with pain and anxiety and isolation, there were a lot of people and a lot of therapeutic tools that helped me feel better when I was at my worst. And over my career, I really want to have that same impact that the same doctors and nurses and physical therapists and therapy programs had on me. And growing up through that experience and moving professionally into digital marketing and ultimately product management, while people can create great impact by offering support for other people, I was really fascinated in how technology could extend that impact by providing scalable tools, information, and support for people also trying to get better control over their health. And when I stumbled across VR in 2014, my mind was blown away, not just by my personal experience of putting on a headset and getting completely transported to another world, but I was also surprised that there were a couple decades of research at that time, since the late 80s, early 90s, showing how VR, through the power of presence, this ability to override the rational brain and transport you somewhere else, had been shown to help uh, soldiers coming back from combat and overcoming their PTSD. It helped promote empathy and reduce racial and implicit bias. It was being used to overcome phobias through exposure therapy and a number of other techniques, and had been widely studied in the area of pain. And it begged the question, if this technology is so powerful, why don't people know about it? Why isn't it being used? And that's really the crux of a lot of problems in healthcare. Things can work in a lab, but don't necessarily translate into the real world. And that became the thesis for Applied VR. We're gonna take proven design principles that have been validated in studies, and we're going to break them out of the lab into the real world by figuring out how to develop the operational model, the business model, the team, the capital, all the things that you need for it to be moving from a feasibility pilot and concept to a commercial product. We've been on this path the last 10 years.
10 years is a pretty good run of it. So why don't we do a quick half step back for those people who maybe conceptually kind of know about virtual reality. It's a thing you stick on your head and you see other stuff. But maybe could you explain a little bit sort of the scientific underpinning of it and what makes it significant and different? I mean, why is it different than watching TV with a really big wide screen? It's curved at the end.
And it's a really important question. And the thing I'll always lead with, if VR isn't needed, just leave it out. It adds something people don't fully understand. It adds cost, it adds friction compared to just using a device that's already in your pocket. But VR is uniquely good at things that a cell phone, a computer, a wearable, and other things don't do, which is our brains haven't evolved to separate virtual from real. And so, an experience I got exposed to when I first experienced VR in depth up at Stanford's Virtual Human Interaction Lab is I was in this lab. I put on a headset, I put on some trackers on my body. And as I look around, I'm in a warehouse and they tell me to look down, and I'm brought up uh, 50 feet above the ground on this plank. And I'm just asked to walk across. Since then, Applied VR create this experience 500 feet up the side of a building to even heighten that effect. And we all think we're rational human beings. And if we were fully rational, we would feel the headset. We would know where we are because you can feel the ground, you have enough cues, you can see some light out of the headset, and you wouldn't have any impact. You'd be able to walk across a shaky plank or walk off the edge of the building without a problem. But because our brains haven't evolved to separate virtual from real, you get sweaty palms, elevated heart rate. Your brain is convinced you're somewhere else. And even though there's, you know, an inkling of a doubt that you're not really there and your rational brain says you are, your brain wants to stop you from putting yourself in a harmful position. And so if you can transport someone else and connect at this deep, non-conscious physiological level, there's all these really powerful things that you could do, particularly as it relates to behavior change. And so that's the principle, is you can create these highly scalable environments that are available on demand. And we learn experientially, but things like role playing and real world experience are harder to recreate at scale. And so VR allows us to program these environments that can predictably create these, transformational experiences for patients. And in our case, it's about teaching skills about how to better self-regulate the nervous system and develop psychological coping skills. And we've really honed in on the design principles to bring these to life in VR, and even shown through studies where we can deliver the same concepts through audio format or through apps. But VR has shown superiority. It just delivers it better. You acquire the skills faster. You retain the skills better, and you apply those skills to your life more effectively.
So let's go specific. Can you describe something about applied VR and the specific clinical issues you're tackling and how you're going about doing it? Just what is the why is there a health condition that needs addressing, and what is sort of the basic science of how you're addressing it, and how does that differ from what's state of the art today?
So AppliedVR developed a product called RelieVR. RelieVR is the first FDA authorized virtual reality medical device indicated for chronic low back pain. It's a 56 session program that patients go through one module a day. That's rooted in evidence-based therapeutic principles rooted in mindfulness, biofeedback and diaphragmatic breathing, cognitive behavioral therapy, and other things that help you learn skills to better manage your pain. We started actually by developing a broad range of different types of programs that we implemented in over 200 hospitals, ranging from things that help patients relax, distraction games, and all these other things that taught us really how to operationalize VR. And as we're helping patients with everything from, we've delivered over 100 babies in VR, we've been used in cancer and dialysis infusions and pediatric procedures and preoperative anxiety. All these different applications were really helpful in understanding how to design VR effectively and developing some foundational business and operational principles. But the thing that we kept coming to when we're helping people recover from surgery or a number of these other use cases is, patients have a lot of support when they're in a clinic or in a hospital, and they're asking to get discharged because they were finding a lot of benefit and want to use it at home. And the doctors and nurses would ask the same. And we realized, in the home, there isn't a whole lot of support for patients with chronic pain. Outside of medication, the other options tend to be interventional with surgeries, procedures, injections, implants, or behavioral of having to find a qualified psychologist or behavioral health professional in your area that has availability and takes your insurance. And so there just was a huge gap. Patients are sometimes on a 6-month wait list to see a pain psychologist or don't have access or coverage in their area. And so we saw this opportunity to bring a lot of these things that are offered traditionally in a clinic and bring it into the home through using the power of VR to deliver these in really effective ways.
Wow. And this is all based on VR-based medicine, or things that were sort of invented offline that you can now digitize or adapt, or both?
They're all adapted from things that work outside of VR. And often I think, I wish our product wasn't needed because cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness, biofeedback, pain neuroscience education, all these things exist, but either they're not easy to access, adherence and engagement is low with these things, they're cost prohibitive, or the resources aren't available in your market, Or in some of these cases, there's stigma around receiving psychological care for your pain when you really want to focus just on dealing with the uh, physiological issues, the tissue damage, the nerve. And so often things that are recommended in the guidelines aren't actually consumed by the patients. And so when we saw what works, we looked at, all this independent validation of showing these that have good effect sizes in the literature. But what we found is when you package them together through an integrated program and deliver it through VR, not only is the effect size higher as we're looking at the actual clinical results through our research compared to these other independent studies, but engagement's really high. So in our clinical trials, patients are engaged close to 5 times a week over an 8-week period, which is incredibly high to keep and incredibly hard to keep someone compliant for that long. When oftentimes getting someone to do something once or twice a week is really hard. Even medication for life sustaining drugs can be 50%. And so getting patients to engage with something that's going to resonate and stick and deliver long lasting benefits is really important. And that's what we're seeing. It's not just effects in the moment, but many patients, even 2 years after completing a single course of treatment, are still experiencing meaningful pain reductions.
So there's clearly a lot of lower back pain out there, back pain, clearly we've struggled, sort of public policy wise and health wise to manage pain given the opioid epidemic and all these things, shortage of providers. So you got a scalable system, like how long did it take you to reach your first billion? That seems like a slam dunk, right?
Yeah, if only healthcare moved at that pace. Sometimes I feel like 10 years in healthcare is maybe a year or two in the consumer sector. And when we were operationalizing in hospitals, we learned a lot. But what we also realized is if we want our product to be widely available, not just to patients who can afford out of pocket, to buy a VR therapeutic program on their own, we wanted this to be just as available as any other drug, as any other procedure, as any other medical device. And so, as part of that, what does that mean to actually make VR part of the standard of care? It should be included in the clinical guidelines, which means you need well-constructed research and really compelling evidence. You also need to work really closely with academic medical centers, key opinion leaders, different advocacy groups. You need to be able to be highly recommended or ideally prescribed by a doctor, which means a regulatory pathway that allows that level of support to deliver something effective and safe. And ideally, you need to have insurance, a provider, or insurance payer cover the cost of this because we're not accustomed to going out of pocket generally for our healthcare consumption. And so, in order to tap into the rails of healthcare and be as easily prescribed and reimbursed as another drug or device, we took this pathway to take virtual reality consumer hardware, lock it down with our software and content, modify the hardware with some of the applications to enable biofeedback and make it unique for our use case, and bring it through FDA as a class 2 device that ultimately could get categorized by CMS as durable medical equipment, which could be paid for and distributed in a similar way as CPAP machines for sleep apnea and other types of connected DME.
And so where are you right now in this journey?
Currently, we're fully covered in the VA health system. And so we're actively being prescribed and distributed to veterans all over the country. Recently, earlier this year, we got coverage by Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield, which is a big blue plan in the Northeast. And so right now, we're also in the path of piloting with a number of different payers and trying to promote the broadest market access. In addition to, as I mentioned, the coding and pricing with CMS, we're working to get coverage there. So again, Medicare beneficiaries could get broad access to this as well. And so it can take several years to get broad market access, but in the meantime, we're seeing really meaningful impact in the VA and the markets that we're active in.
So, we're several years in at least now into sort of the digitization of healthcare. There's a lot of companies working on VR-based medical device solutions. How easy is it to get coverage from, the biggest payer in the country from, CMS?
It's not easy, but there's a path with good science, good product development, and a lot of data, not just clinical data, but real world evidence and other data points to show that not just is there clinical utility, but there's real world usage of your product. And that often is the number one question as we're having conversations with payers and medical directors at all types of plans, which is the fundamental principles are sound. It's based on evidence-based cognitive behavioral therapy and other programs that they understand and they're offering to their beneficiaries. We've run really well-designed research that not just shows the impact at the end of treatment, but durability following the patients for 2 years after. But where there's been a lot of disillusionment in the industry is things that are paid for, but not consumed. And one of the big national payers shared some benchmark data that shows, under a quarter of patients actually stay engaged with the therapy that gets prescribed and paid for. And so having to deliver, compared to in some cases where it's 8% adherence, makes it really hard to gain adoption from payers. And so a number of these pilots, and a big part of the focus of AppliedVR as we're rolling out programs is not just to continue the patient-reported outcomes and show the clinical benefits, but show patients use it and like it. Because if that's the case, we could expect to see the same type of results that we'll see in our study. Whereas if it just sits on the shelf, it would be impossible to get the therapeutic benefit. And so a big focus is on that uptake by patients.
Do you think that a future applied VR that's going to get started today will have an easier time because you and some of your peer companies have helped break down the pathways, or do you think it's still a high bar and there's still, how much easier will it be after you all are, have gotten there and demonstrated this to everybody?
We established a de novo pathway with the FDA. We established a unique HCPCS code for virtual reality behavioral devices. We've got the first payers on board. It certainly will be easier for future companies to be able to use the predicate, device for their FDA pathway to leverage existing codes that have been established. But you still have to do the work. And so even if you have the blueprint of what needs to get done, it still can cost tens of millions of dollars in many years to set up that pathway. And the challenge also with healthcare is when you have a regulated product, you can't innovate as quickly as unregulated products. And while you can make the claims and while you can get reimbursed, you also have to think through the product strategy about how you manage that lifestyle management that maintains the integrity of a regulated product, but also adapts to the growing needs and capabilities that exist in the technology world. And so it's far from a straightforward business, but we're really optimistic about the path that we set. And it's really encouraging to see other people follow that path as well.
And what advice would you have for somebody starting a new venture today? Have an idea, maybe they've done some lab research, what can you tell them to save them some time and heartache?
One of the things that I wish I did sooner was FDA is often seen as this gatekeeper to the market and can seem quite scary. The reality is FDA is incredibly collaborative and they're constantly releasing new policies or guidance documents to try to encourage innovation faster in the market. So there are things now like the predetermined change control plan, where in theory you can establish a framework of all the changes you're going to make to your product in the future that FDA can acknowledge doesn't require some type of regulatory approval. So you're establishing the parameters, you're setting the testing guidelines, you're establishing the documentation needs, which means you can go faster if you collaborate with FDA versus if you do it in isolation or try to work around them. And I'd say the same is true about payers. Medical directors can be very forthcoming about where their skepticism and needs are. And so if you're only talking to them when you're trying to force a policy decision, you could be at a disadvantage. And so because there's so many disparate and unique stakeholders, the more you could build a strong connection with them early, understand their needs, and design a business around the constraints and opportunities there, the better. And so it's not always clear of who all the stakeholders are because there's so many. But going through that exercise of figuring out who's the enabler for your future product and business, and can you anticipate their needs early on?
Oh, any last comments on, you talked about payers, you talked about regulators. What about the providers, the people prescribing your therapy?
The most important thing that we found with providers is to make sure that workflows do not get disrupted. Innovation can be an exciting word for especially venture-backed tech startups, and could be a really scary word for providers because often they're not paid for innovating. Innovation could add new systems and training and staffing and costs and things that prevent them from being able to provide the clinical care and run their businesses. And so they're a really important stakeholder also in the product design of understanding the needs. And I'll give a real quick anecdote there. You know, we're a California-based company. Now we're fully distributed, but we're headquartered in Los Angeles. LA has some of the best game development and entertainment talent that we put to work in developing some of the VR content that we built. And one of the breathing sessions, when we first created it, the idea was as you breathe, you see your breath in VR. And as you breathe and slow down your breathing, you get positive feedback and reinforcement, and the scene changes around you. And the writers behind it created this narrative that the world was robbed of energy thousands of years ago. And as you breathe, you're breathing energy back into this world. And we go to Knoxville, Tennessee, to a pain clinic, and we sit down in a conference room with patients, and they hated it because 3,000 years ago, their literal interpretation, of what the world should be based on where they live and their beliefs and faith of the world was at odds with this creative narrative that we put forward. And we realized that we needed our content and the story behind it to be accepted by all, and to have sensitivities to the cultures and beliefs and demographics and other people playing a part in it. And without the partnership with the provider and having access to those insights, we'd have never been able to develop a program that's as widely accepted as it has been over the last several years. And so partnership and product, partnership and operational implementation, all those things are really, really important.
That's a great example. I'm going to remember that example. That's a terrific example. So let's wrap up with one thought from you. More broadly, what are you excited to see happen in our industry in healthcare and med tech in 2025, since we're almost there?
There's a number of policy changes that are coming that I think, can be real enablers with the reimbursement and adoption of these healthcare technologies. It's really nice to see these new behavioral health codes that will mimic RTM and allow mental health SAMD applications to have a path to reimbursement. It's exciting to see the remote therapeutic monitoring and remote patient monitoring codes remove some of those prohibitive limits of having to reach 16 days of data collection in order to be able to support reimbursement, because the administrative burden can be overly high that makes the juice not worth the squeeze with some of these reimbursement codes. It is exciting to see FDA to have some of these predetermined change control pathways, which will also make AI-driven technologies easier to get into the market. Because outside of radiology, a number of companies, and a hot topic with the AdvaMed Digital Health Board, is what is the regulatory and reimbursement pathways for generative AI and AI technologies that aren't just simply being used for kind of diagnostic recognition, that are fundamentally different technologies to implement. And I do expect to see more payers have commercial coverage of technologies like RelieVR and other technologies in the marketplace. And so 2025 should be a big year for showing adoption and encouraging at least early adoption in the marketplace that builds foundational data to understand who this is best for, how is it being used, are we seeing the clinical expectations that we saw in clinical trials? Are there gaps in translating this to real world use? And so we're making progress. The progress is slow, but I expect all these tailwinds to help encourage it.
So 2025 should show, or at least lay the groundwork for, a lot of acceleration.
That's right.
All right. Well, that sounds like a good 2025. Well, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll catch you at another conference in the near future.
All right. Thanks, Randy.
Thank
Appreciate the
you.
conversation.